October in the low country of Dakota Territory tasted like iron and wet soil. The grass had gone brittle under the first frost, snapping underfoot like something that had forgotten it was ever alive, and the ground beneath it still breathed, pushing damp upward through every surface that rested on it. The sky hung flat and gray, the color of a wool blanket left too long in the rain, and chimney smoke from the half-finished cabin flattened and spread under that sky and went nowhere, as though the air itself had decided to refuse passage. Ingrid Holt pressed her bare palm flat against the floor inside the cabin and held it there. The dirt was cold in the way a riverbank is cold in November. Not the passive cold of stone, but the active cold of something with water moving through it. And water that had no interest in stopping. When she lifted her hand, the skin glistened. She wiped it on her skirt and did not say what she was thinking, which was that the floor would freeze solid before Christmas and they would be sleeping on ice. She had done the arithmetic on the back of the deed paper during the wagon ride out from town, writing small, because the margins were narrow, and the pencil she borrowed from the driver had been worn to almost nothing. The numbers did not argue with each other. They simply refused to add up to anything that looked like survival. $11 in hand. $31 owed to Harlan Voss's general store, a debt that included nails and flour and lamp oil, and one pane of glass that had cracked during delivery, which Voss had charged for anyway because Voss charged for everything that passed through his hands, regardless of its condition when it arrived. One cow old, but still giving milk. One boy who had not spoken since his father's funeral. One younger sister whose cough filled every night with a sound like paper being slowly torn in half. The claim sat 2 miles from the shallow bend of the Cheyenne River and 18 miles from the nearest rail stop. The trail that connected it to anything resembling civilization had washed out in autumn rains and would not be passable to a loaded wagon until spring. Ingrid had understood this before she came. She had chosen to come anyway because the claim was the only property in her name, and property in her name was the only thing standing between her family and a future that belonged entirely to other people. Erik Holt had filed the claim the previous spring, full of the particular optimism that the territory seemed to produce in men who had never tried to winter in it. He had cut logs for the north and west walls and raised them with a neighbor's help, and the work was solid squared timbers chinked with a mixture of mud and straw that had cured hard and would hold wind. The south and east walls were a different matter. He had patched them with salvaged boards from a collapsed freight shed 3 miles east, and the wood had already begun to shrink and gap, leaving spaces wide enough to let in dust in dry weather and water in wet. He had stacked 1 1/4 cords of split wood against the west wall before the accident, which was enough to heat the cabin for perhaps 3 weeks if the stove drew well and the wind stayed modest. The axle had slipped its pin on a freight run in late August. The wheel hub caught Erik between it and the wagon bed and crushed his ribs in a way that left him conscious long enough to understand what was happening, but not long enough for anyone to reach him with help. He died on the side of a road that did not have a name 4 hours after the accident. A man Ingrid had never met rode to the rooming house where she and Lars and Sina were waiting and handed her Erik's hat and $11 in coin that had been in his coat pocket. He also brought the deed paper and the account from Voss's store folded together as though someone had thought it considerate to deliver the obligation alongside the evidence of ownership. She had looked at those 2 documents for a long time in the dim light of the rooming house. Then she had begun to write on the back of the deed paper because there was no other paper available, and because writing the numbers down was the only way to see whether they might arrange themselves differently than they appeared in her head. They did not. 6 cords of wood to survive a full winter. 1 1/4 cords stacked, cordwood from the nearest supplier at $4 a cord delivered, but no delivery possible because the trail had washed out and no teamster would risk his axle on that grade for a widow's credit. She could cut her own wood if she had a crosscut saw, in the strength in the weeks remaining before the ground froze. She had an axe. She did not have a saw. She had at most 4 weeks before the weather made outdoor work into a different kind of dying. She put the pencil down and looked at her son, who was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with both hands in his lap looking at the floor. Lars was 6 years old and had been quiet since the day they buried his father. Not the quiet of a child who had nothing to say, but the quiet of a child who had decided for reasons of his own that the words available to him were inadequate to what had happened. He still responded to direct questions with nods and shakes. He still came when called. But the running commentary that small children keep up about the world, the constant naming and questioning and narrating that Ingrid had lived inside for 6 years, had stopped as completely as if someone had closed a valve. Sina had been 19 years old when she followed Ingrid west from Minnesota, and she was still 19 now, though she looked older. She had their mother's narrowness through the shoulders and their father's stubbornness in the set of her jaw, and she had come because Ingrid had needed someone, and Sina had been the someone available. The cough had started on the train and had not stopped. Some nights it woke Ingrid from sleep, that sound of tearing paper, and Ingrid would lie in the dark and listen and calculate as though the right arrangement of numbers might produce a solution that the daylight hours had not. The wagon driver who brought them out from town had not spoken much during the 2-hour ride which Ingrid had taken as professional courtesy until she saw his face when he looked at the cabin for the first time. He helped carry the trunk inside without comment, accepted the 50 cents she offered, and drove back down the grade without suggesting he might return. The cabin was worse than Erik's letters had described. This was not surprising. Erik had been a man who wrote to the best version of things, not out of dishonesty exactly, but out of a genuine inability to see the difference between what he was building and what he intended to build. The log walls on the north and west were solid enough. The board walls on the south and east had gaps at every joint where the lumber had shrunk, and the light came through those gaps in thin lines that would become wind in October and something worse in January. The roof was sod over poles. The floor was packed dirt. Ingrid checked the east wall at floor level and found frost beginning to climb the boards from below a white line perhaps 3/4 of an inch above the ground. She pressed her fingertip against it and felt the cold push back immediately, not through the air, but through the wood itself. She straightened up and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at everything she had to work with. And the sum of it was this 4 walls of unequal quality, a roof that would let in water wherever the sod had settled unevenly, a stove that appeared functional, 1¼ cords of wood, a dirt floor that was actively wet on the 23rd of October, and no clear path to any of the things that would need to change before the first hard freeze. Lars had carried his jacket inside and hung it on the nail beside the door, with the care of a child who has learned that objects matter more when there are fewer of them. He sat down on the trunk, which was the only furniture that had traveled with them, and held a short length of kindling in both hands as though it were something valuable. Sina sat beside him and put her arm around his shoulders and said nothing, and the three of them existed in the cabin together for a long moment in which no one had anything useful to say. Ingrid set the flour sack on the shelf that Erik had built above the stove and turned to assess what could be done before dark. Raymond Cobb arrived 3 days after Ingrid on a brown mare with a clipboard tied to his saddle and a beard the color of rope that has been stored in a damp place. He was 58 years old and had spent 11 years before this one moving supply wagons across terrain that actively resisted being crossed, and the experience had given him a way of looking at structures that made them feel their own inadequacies. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, first pressing his thumb into the chinking on the log walls and pulling at the boards on the south side until one flexed noticeably in its frame, and standing for a long moment at the northeast corner, where the ground sloped toward the cabin, instead of away from it, which was the kind of thing a man notices when he has spent a decade watching moisture find its way into things that were supposed to keep it out. Then he came inside. He stood on the dirt floor for a long time without speaking, his eyes moving from the stove to the roof poles, to the gap under the south door, where a line of light showed even with the door closed. He looked at the dark stain along the base of the east wall, where water had been wicking upward through the boards since the first rain. Then he crouched and pressed his own palm flat against the dirt floor, the way Ingrid had done 3 days earlier, and held it there and wiped it on his knee. "You have half a frame and 2 good walls." He said it the way he might have said a bridge was passable with light loads, not encouraging but not cruel either. "Just a measurement," Ingrid said she knew. "You have maybe 1¼ cords stacked. You need 6 minimum more if January runs long." He paused. "Damp dirt steals heat faster than wind through chinks. You can plug every gap in these walls, and that stove will still lose half its work to the ground." He stood, and the way he did it told Ingrid that what came next was the real assessment, the one he had come to deliver. A man with money puts in a plank floor raised 10 inches above grade. A man with less money digs a ditch on 3 sides to pull the water table down. A man with nothing. He stopped. Ingrid waited. Outside, the wind moved across the sod roof and the cabin made a small sound in response, the sound of something doing its best. A man with nothing does what? Her voice was level. She wanted to hear him say it because she had already said it to herself twice, and she needed to know whether his version matched hers. He looked at Lars, who was sitting on the trunk again, holding the same piece of kindling. He looked at Sina on the sleeping platform, the cloth she kept over her mouth to catch the cough when it came. He said, a man with nothing sells the cow, takes rooms in town for the winter, and lets Voss buy the low acres in spring. That's the honest answer. Ingrid said the cow was not for sale. He told her the rest of the arithmetic without softening it. A ditch dug on 3 sides required a man with a spade and 8 days of labor. Replanking the south and east walls required lumber she could not afford. Raising the dirt floor required joists and planks and a man who knew how to set them. All of it needed to be completed before the ground froze in late November, and it was already the 3rd week of October. How much to hire the labor? More than $11. He folded the clipboard under his arm and moved toward the door, and at the threshold he turned back one final time with the expression of a man who has given an honest report and knows it will not be acted upon. Stubborn keeps you warm until December. It doesn't keep you warm after that. The door closed. Ingrid listened to the mare's hooves on the hard ground until the sound faded into the wind. Then she knelt on the floor and pressed both palms flat against the dirt and felt the cold rise through her skin like a debt coming due, steady and patient and indifferent to the terms she might prefer. Lars's voice came from the trunk, careful and tentative, the first unprompted words he had spoken in 2 weeks. Mama, is the floor supposed to be wet? No. She kept her palms flat against the ground a moment longer, feeling the wet climb into her skin. No, it is not. That question stayed in the room after he stopped asking it. It hung in the air above the stove and settled into the corners, and was still there 3 days later when Ingrid woke in the dark with her hip aching and the cold pressing up through the palate, with a determination that the stove's warmth could not match. She had moved to the floor 2 weeks after arriving because Sina needed the sleeping platform. The cough was worse when she lay flat, and Lars slept better beside his aunt than in the cold air below. The pallet was folded blankets over straw, over packed dirt, and the layering made almost no difference. The cold came through all of it with the same steady patience. She sat up and pressed her palm against the dirt beside the pallet, and the surface was wet the way stone sweats in a cellar when warm air meets cold mass, not muddy, not puddled, just perpetually wet, as though the ground were engaged in a continuous effort to make everything above it the same temperature as everything below. She moved her hand to the edge of the stove's heat circle where the dirt should have been warmest and found it damp there too. The stove had been burning for 4 hours. It would burn all night, and every hour of heat it produced would go partly upward into the air of the cabin and partly downward into the ground, which would absorb it without acknowledgement and send moisture back up in return. The understanding came to her not as an idea, but as a physical sensation, the way cold itself arrives. The floor was not just cold, it was a conduit, an active system moving energy in one direction and moisture in the other. And it would keep doing this regardless of how much wood she fed the stove, because the system was not the stove and the wood. The system was the ground. She could not change the ground. She could only change what sat between the ground and the space where her family needed to live. She lay back down and stared at the dark above her and let her mind go to a place it had not gone in 20 years, which was her father's workshop in Maine. The smell of pine pitch warming on an iron plate, the feel of cold stone under bare feet. She had been 7 years old, maybe 8. Her father, Henrik Linkvist, had been doing a job for the neighbor 2 farms over, a man named Bergstrom, who had built his house with the timber sill sitting directly on the stone foundation, which worked well enough in summer and became a problem every winter when moisture wicked upward through the wood and made the lower rooms feel like the inside of a well. Her father had laid strips of white birch bark between the foundation stones and the timber sill, and he had explained it to Ingrid in the way that people who understand things explain them to children, simply and completely, without condescension. He had poured a cup of water onto a piece of bark laid flat on the stone surface. Ingrid had watched the water bead and slide sideways instead of soaking through. He had pressed his thumb against the underside of the bark and shown her. Dry. The stone beneath was dry, because the water had gone sideways rather than down. "The bark does not keep the cold out," he had said, holding her small hand and moving it slowly across the dry underside of the bark. "It keeps the wet out. Dry wood holds warmth. Wet wood steals it." She had not thought about that afternoon in 20 years. She thought about it now, lying on her damp pallet on a dirt floor in Dakota Territory, and she thought about it carefully, turning it over the way you turn an unfamiliar tool to understand its purpose. The principle her father had described was not complicated. It required only a surface that refused water positioned between the source of moisture and the space that needed to stay dry. She had been thinking about the floor as a surface to be replaced. What if it was a surface to be covered? She did not know whether there were birch trees along the Cheyenne River. She did not know how much bark she would need, or whether the idea was anything more than a memory pressed against desperation until it took the shape of a solution. But she knew one thing with the certainty of someone who had watched water beat on bark and slide off, and who had felt dry stone beneath. The principle was real. The question was whether the materials existed within walking distance of a woman with no horse, no money, and 4 weeks before the first hard freeze. In the morning, she left Lars with instructions to keep the stove fed and told Sina she was going to the river. She put on Erik's coat, which hung past her hips and smelled of axle grease and the particular kind of work sweat that does not wash out, and she walked toward the Cheyenne. The near bank was alder and willow, mostly thin stuff, good for nothing heavier than basket weaving or kindling. She walked upstream for a quarter-mile along the bank, the ground rising slightly before it dropped again into the oxbow where the water slowed. And there, in the crook of that bend, where the soil had enough elevation to stay drier than the surrounding bottomland, she found what she needed. A stand of white birch, perhaps 30 trees. Most were alive. Several were dead or fallen, and the fallen trunks still wore their bark in loose curling sheets that lifted at the edges and smelled of the particular sweetness that dead wood develops when the decay is slow. She peeled a piece from a fallen trunk. It came away in a sheet 18 inches wide and almost 2 feet long, pale and smooth on the outside, layered and papery on the inner face. She rolled it carefully, white side out, the way she had seen her father handle bark, using gentle, even pressure and no sharp bends. She harvested 6 rolls before she walked back, which took longer than she expected, because the ground between the birch stand and the cabin was soft with the recent rain, and her feet sank into it at every step. The first experiment was simple. She laid 2 sheets flat on the dirt floor near the stove, overlapping the edges by 4 inches, and placed a cup of melted snow on top of the bark. Then she went back to work on other things, bringing in wood, checking the chinking on the north wall, where a section had begun to soften, and came back to the bark after an hour. She lifted the sheets. The dirt beneath the overlap was dry. The dirt 6 inches beyond the bark's edge was wet. She held her palm flat against the dry dirt for 10 seconds, feeling the absence of moisture as something almost physical, the way you feel the absence of wind when you step inside from a gale. It was not proof of anything beyond the principle she already understood. It was not a floor. It was 1 cup of water and 2 pieces of bark on 3 square feet of ground. But it was the principle confirmed, and the confirmation settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 weeks. She set the bark aside and picked up the pencil and the deed paper and began to calculate. The cabin floor measured 16 feet by 18 feet, 288 square feet. With 4-inch overlaps on every seam, she needed roughly 300 square feet of bark, accounting for waste and irregular shapes. At the dimensions of the sheets she had gathered, averaging perhaps 18 inches by 22 inches, she needed somewhere between 45 and 55 sheets to cover the floor. She would need pine pitch to seal the seams and dry sand to protect the bark surface from boot soles and sparks in the dragging of furniture. The plan had a shape. The plan had requirements. The plan had a timeline determined by weather, and the weather did not negotiate. She did not tell Sina the full scope of it. She said only that she was gathering bark. Sina looked at the rolls drying near the stove and said nothing, which was its own kind of response, the silence of someone who thought the idea might be too fragile for questions, which Ingrid understood because she thought so too. Harlan Voss arrived on the 2nd Sunday of November in his buckboard, with his name painted on the side in careful letters, and he brought a small sack of flour as a gesture that resembled concern without containing any. He was 46 years old, lean through the face with hands that stayed clean because he paid other men to do the work that dirtied them. He had been in the territory for 9 years and had been extending credit to settlers for 7 of those years and collecting on that credit in ways that reliably resulted in the transfer of property from those who could not pay to those who could sell. He had told Erik Holt when Erik was alive that the low ground along the Cheyenne Bend would make excellent hay production in dry years. Erik had told him the land was not for sale. Voss had said that all land was for sale eventually, which was a statement that had proven accurate often enough that he no longer felt it necessary to add qualifications. He stepped inside without waiting and set the flower on the shelf and turned to face the room. His eyes moved across the stove, the sleeping platform, the collection of bark rolls stacked against the wall near the door. He crossed to the rolls and nudged one with the toe of his boot. "I brought flour. You're low, I expect." Ingrid said she was grateful. "I see bark." His tone was exploratory, the tone of a man cataloging details for later use. "Are you weaving baskets?" "No." He looked at the floor. He looked at the bark rolls. He picked one up and unrolled 6 inches of it and pressed his thumb against the inner surface and then let it curl back. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "Your account is at $31. I'm carrying you because Erik was reliable, but I need to see a path to payment before the ground freezes." Ingrid said she intended to prove up on the claim and make payment from the spring planting. Spring planting requires seed, which requires money, which requires credit, which requires that I believe the person asking will still be here when the ground thaws. He let that sit for a moment, watching her face for the particular expression that people showed when they understood they were at a disadvantage. "I'll buy the cow against $20 of the debt. That leaves 11 owing, which I'll carry until June if you sign over the low acres as security." The low acres were the part of the claim that ran down to the river bend. They were the part that flooded every other spring and grew nothing but sedge grass and mud. They were also the part that Voss had specifically wanted when Erik was alive, which meant they were worth something to someone who understood the territory well enough to know the difference between what land looked like and what it could be made to produce. "If they're useless to me, why do you want them?" Voss's expression did not change. He had patience the way a river has patience, not as a virtue but as a method. "I'm offering you a way to reduce your debt and keep the cabin. Stubborn women make orphans before spring." She noticed that he used the same word Cobb had used, stubborn, as though the men in this territory had agreed on a single word for a woman who declined to do as she was advised, and the word carried its own season's worth of warning inside it. She said she would not sell the cow and would not sign over the acres and would make payment in spring. Voss looked at the bark rolls one more time. He looked at the dirt floor. He did the thing with his expression that landed just short of a smile. "What is the bark for, the floor?" He looked at the packed dirt. He looked at the bark. "You're papering the dirt like it's a parlor wall." He picked up the empty flour sack he had arrived with, folded it under his arm, and walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "I'll check the account in January. If you've left, I'll take what I'm owed." The buckboard rattled down the grade, and the sound of the wheels on the frozen ruts lasted longer than it should have, carrying up the slope and into the cabin like a final word. Lars, who had been sitting behind the stove during the whole conversation with his knees pulled to his chest, waited until the sound was fully gone. "Mama, what's a parlor wall?" "It's a wall in a room that people only use when they want to show visitors they have nice things." He considered this. "We don't have nice things." "No, we don't." She put the flour on the shelf beside the other flour. She looked at the bark rolls. She looked at the floor. She knew what Voss's phrase would become. By the end of the week, everyone within 6 miles would know that the Holt widow was papering the dirt like it was a parlor wall, and they would repeat it the way people repeat an image that gives them something to picture, because picturing a thing is easier than thinking about it. She picked up a bark roll and carried it to the stove. She unrolled it slowly, warming it near the heat until the edges relaxed, and carried it to the northeast corner where the damp was worst and laid it flat against the dirt. She pressed the edges down with her hands. She measured 4 inches of overlap from the wall. She cut the bark with the knife she used for everything, trimming the edge straight, and then heated a small lump of pine pitch in a cracked kettle, until it softened and spread it along the seam with a rag wrapped around her thumb and pressed the bark flat. The pitch smelled like the inside of a pine forest on a hot day. The bark felt smooth and rigid under her fingers. She pressed her hand against the dirt beyond the bark's edge and felt the wet. She pressed her hand against the bark itself and felt the surface temperature but not the moisture, and the difference between those two sensations, wet and dry, both cold, but one of them sealed against what the other was still surrendering to, was the distance between what the floor was and what she needed it to become. 20 square feet, 268 to go. Clara Strand found her at the river 3 days later, stripping bark from a dead birch trunk with the knife. Clara was 34 years old and had 4 children and a husband with a full cabin and 4 cords of wood stacked, which placed her in a category of settler that was survivable rather than comfortable. She had a practical intelligence sharpened by years of managing too many needs with too few resources, and she watched Ingrid work for a moment before speaking. "What are you doing with bark?" The question was not rhetorical. Clara was a woman who asked questions because she wanted answers, not because she wanted an opportunity to provide them. Ingrid explained. She described the wet floor and the frost climbing the east wall each morning. She described the heat disappearing into the damp ground faster than the stove could replace it. She described her father's method from Maine, the bark between stone and timber, sill, the water beating and sliding sideways the dry stone beneath. She described the cup of water she had poured on the bark on the cabin floor and the dried dirt she had found underneath it. Clara listened with her arms crossed, which Ingrid had already learned meant she was calculating rather than dismissing. When Ingrid finished, Clara said, "Bark is for canoes and baskets and kindling. I've never heard of anyone putting it on a floor. My father put it between stone and timber." "Your father had stone and timber. You have dirt." Ingrid said the principle was the same. Stop the water before it enters the living space. The material that stops it adapts to what is available. Clara uncrossed her arms and looked at the bark rolls. "How many days has this taken you?" 2 days so far. In 2 days, you could have hauled half a cord from the deadfall east of Cobb's fence line. Half a cord is 2 more weeks of heat. Bark scraps on dirt is not 2 weeks of heat. If the floor stays wet, 6 cords will not be enough. The heat goes into the ground and disappears. And if the bark does nothing, you've lost 2 days you cannot get back, and your boy still has no boots that fit. She was not wrong. That was the difficulty with Clara's skepticism. It was grounded in the arithmetic of survival that every woman on the claim line understood in her bones. Every hour spent on an unproven idea was an hour not spent on proven work. A hauled cord was a hauled cord. Bark on a dirt floor was a theory, and theories did not keep children from freezing. Clara left without offering to help and without saying she would not, which was the most honest response available to a woman with 4 children of her own and no surplus for anyone else's experiments. But the conversation cost Ingrid something she could not afford to spend, which was certainty. Not in the idea remained what it had been, a principle confirmed by a cup of water and a memory of dry stone. But certainty in the timeline, in the calculation, in the belief that the days she was spending on bark were the right days to spend this way. She sat on the fallen trunk after Clara left and looked at the 12 rolls in her arms and did the arithmetic one more time. It was early November. Hard freeze came in late November or early December. 4 weeks at most. In 4 weeks, she needed to gather and prepare 300 square feet of bark collect and heat enough pine pitch to seal 50 or more seams, haul enough dry sand to cover the entire floor to a depth of 1 inch, and continue cutting and stacking firewood, because the bark floor, even if it worked perfectly, could not replace the fuel that the stove consumed. 4 weeks, 1 woman, 2 people who needed her and could help only in small ways. No horse, no saw, no money. She stood up and walked back to the river and peeled another sheet of bark from the fallen trunk. The strip came away clean, 20 inches wide, and she rolled it carefully and added it to the pile and walked back toward the cabin. The wind had shifted north during the hour she had spent talking with Clara, and it carried a quality that the previous day's wind had not, something flat and final in it, the beginning of something that would not be negotiated with. She woke the next morning to find that someone had been at the birch stand before her. She saw it as she approached along the bank, fresh cuts on the fallen trunk she had been working. clean cuts made with a tool sharper than her knife. The bark had been taken in whole sheets, and the cuts had been made around the knots rather than through them, which was why the edges were clean, where hers had tended to split. She stood looking at the cuts for a moment, then crouched to read the prints in the mud at the base of the trunk. Moccasin tracks pressed firmly into the soft ground, moving upriver along the bank and then cutting away from the water toward the low bluffs to the north. She had lost bark she had been planning to use. She had also learned something she had not known, that there was a correct way to cut around the knots, and that whoever had been here knew it, and that they had been here while she was working, which meant they had seen her working and had either chosen not to speak or had not found her methods worth addressing directly. She filed both observations and went back to cutting bark, trying this time to angle the knife around the knots rather than through them, and losing 2 sheets to splitting before she got the angle right, and losing 1 more before she understood that it was not only the angle but the starting point. You began at the natural seam where the bark had already begun to separate, and you followed that seam rather than imposing your own line on it. 3 days later, she tore a sheet while trying to flatten it cold. The bark split along a worm channel she had not seen, and the piece, a good 2 feet wide, harvested and carried and worth 40 minutes of work, cracked in half. She could still burn it, still use it for patches, but it was gone from the inventory she was building toward. She was kneeling on the cabin floor trying to fit the cracked pieces together when a voice came from the doorway. "You're flattening it cold. Deadfall bark must be warmed first." The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, perhaps older, her face weathered past the point where age could be read precisely. She wore a heavy wool coat over a dress that combined settler fabric with beadwork at the cuffs, and her hair was braided and wrapped. She carried a basket on one arm and a bundle of bark strips on the other. She stepped inside without being invited the way Cobb and Voss had stepped inside, but unlike either of them, she removed her moccasins at the threshold and set them beside the door before crossing onto the dirt floor. She crouched beside the cracked piece and pressed her thumb along the split. Deadfall bark dries and stiffens. If you bend it cold, it cracks at the worm channels and the knot scars. Warm it near the stove first, not on it. Let it remember what it was before it dried. Ingrid asked her name. The woman said it was Mae Birch. She was Ojibwe and Métis and had been trading barkwork medicines and repaired harness with settlers along the Cheyenne for longer than most of the settlers had been there. She had seen Ingrid working at the river and watched for 3 days before deciding whether to come. "You watched me for 3 days. I needed to see whether you were working seriously or just filling time until the weather changed your mind." Mae took the cracked piece from Ingrid's watch and carried it to the stove and held it at arm's length from the iron surface. After a minute, she bent it slowly. The bark flexed without cracking. She handed it back. "The heat does not make it soft. It makes it willing." Ingrid took the piece and bent it carefully and felt the difference, not pliability exactly, but a kind of cooperation that the cold had prevented. She looked at Mae. "The bark I found at the river already stripped. The clean cuts. That was you. You were cutting through the knots. I cut around them. That is why your sheets split and mine do not." Mae walked to the corner where Ingrid had laid the first 30 square feet of bark. She crouched and ran her finger along a seam pressed down. A thin line of moisture appeared at the edge. She stood without commenting on what the moisture meant because it did not need commentary. "Why are you putting bark on the floor?" Ingrid explained. The damp, the heat loss, her father's method in Maine, the cup of water that had beaded on bark and slid sideways the dry dirt she had found beneath. Mae listened without interrupting. When Ingrid finished, Mae said, "Your father understood one piece. The bark sheds water, but you are missing 2 other pieces, and without them, this floor will fail before January." The weight of that sentence sat in the room, not discouraging exactly. Mae's voice carried no particular feeling about Ingrid's chances, but precise in the way that true assessments are precise. "What 2 pieces? I will show you, but not today. Today you learn to cut bark without destroying it." She spent the next 2 hours teaching Ingrid to harvest from deadfall. The instruction was almost entirely physical. Mae placed Ingrid's hands on the trunk and showed her where to begin the cut at the edge of a natural seam where the bark had already started to separate from the wood beneath. She showed her the angle of the knife nearly flat, following the curve of the wood rather than fighting it. She showed her how to use the heel of her hand to peel the sheet back, gradually maintaining even tension so that the bark came away in one piece rather than tearing along its hidden channels. She showed her the knots, not obstacles, but guides places to circle rather than cross. By the end of the afternoon, Ingrid had harvested 4 sheets without a single crack. They were wider and more uniform than anything she had managed working alone, and she held them in her hands for a moment and felt the weight of the knowledge embedded in them. Not her knowledge, but knowledge she had been allowed access to. Mae rolled the sheets carefully and said, "Tomorrow I will show you why your seams are wrong. You have laid them like blanket edges. They must go like shingles on a roof." "What's the difference?" Mae looked at her with an expression that contained neither impatience nor the false patience of someone suppressing impatience, but something more straightforward than either the expression of a person assessing whether the question deserves a direct answer or a demonstration. "Water follows the easiest path. A blanket edge gives water a place to collect and wait. A shingle edge sends water away. Which direction do you want the damp to travel?" "Away." Obviously irreversibly away from everything that needed to stay dry. Mae picked up her basket and put her moccasins back on at the threshold and walked out into the gray afternoon without ceremony. Ingrid stood in the doorway and watched her go down the grade toward the river path, the basket swinging from one arm, her footsteps making almost no sound on the frozen ground. Sina's voice came from the sleeping platform. "Who was that?" "Someone who knows bark better than I do." "Does she think the floor will work?" Ingrid considered the question. Mae had not said whether she thought the floor would work. She had said the seams were wrong and the bark was being cut badly. She had corrected the cutting without being asked. She had promised to return. She had said there were 2 things missing, which was different from saying the floor would fail. It was more like saying a garment was missing its seams, not that the fabric was wrong. "She thinks I'm doing it wrong." That is different from thinking it won't work. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall small and dry, and like the kind that melted on skin and announced nothing in particular. But behind it to the north, the sky carried a color that Ingrid had learned from her father when she was young, a yellowish cast to the gray that he had called the wolf sky, the sky that lies, that shows a mild face while the real weather gathers strength behind it. Her father had grown up in the Northeast, had seen that color precede storms that lasted for days. She watched it for a long moment, then closed the door and fed the stove and picked up a bark sheet and held it near the heat until she felt it shift from rigid to willing. 20 square feet laid, 30 done by tomorrow if the seams held, 258 left, and the sky was turning, and somewhere behind that color the winter was completing its preparations without any interest in her timeline or her plans. She pressed the bark flat against the dirt and spread pitch along the seam and covered it with sand. Outside, the snow thickened, and the cold pressed its hands against the walls, and the walls held for now, and the floor was becoming something different from what it had been, 1 sheet at a time, in a cabin that everyone with the authority to have an opinion had told her to abandon. She did not abandon it. She laid the bark. The seam held. The pitch dried in the warmth from the stove and darkened to the color of old wood, and for the first time since she had arrived, the corner where she was kneeling smelled of something other than damp earth. It smelled of pine. It smelled of a forest she was slowly teaching the floor to remember. Mae returned the next morning before the light was fully established, arriving at the cabin door with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth tucked under one arm and a clay pot sealed with a leather cap in her opposite hand. She sat both on the floor near the stove, without explanation, and crouched beside the northeast corner, where Ingrid had laid her first 30 square feet of bark. She ran one finger slowly along a seam pressed down with her thumb and watched the thin line of moisture that rose at the edge. She did not look surprised. She looked like a person confirming something she had already measured from a distance. She opened the clay pot and held it near the stove's warmth. The smell that rose from it was pine pitch mixed with something richer and more animal, and beneath both of those a gritty quality like fine ash carried on a cold wind. Pitch alone contracts in hard cold. It pulls away from the bark edges, and by January your seams will be open and the damp will come through from inside rather than below. She dipped a flat stick into the warmed mixture and drew a line along the edge of a bark scrap, and the compound spread more smoothly than raw pitch, gripping the surface without beating, without sliding. Pitch rendered fat and hardwood ash sifted fine. The fat keeps the pitch from going brittle. The ash gives it purchase. She paused, and something crossed her expression that was not quite sentiment, but occupied its vicinity. The Ojibwe people used this on canoe seams in the Great Lakes country. Those canoes stayed dry through 3 seasons of hard water. Ingrid reached for the stick. Mae pulled it back not unkindly, but with the firmness of a teacher who knows that watching comes before doing. First you fix what you have already laid. The seams are wrong, and wrong seams will fail regardless of what fills them. She walked Ingrid through the problem with her hands. The bark Ingrid had placed in the northeast corner was laid flat edge to flat edge, the seams aligned so that moisture had a straight path from one side to the other. Mae called this blanket seaming, and she showed what it produced by pressing a cup of water against one of Ingrid's seams and watching the water find its way through in under a minute, wicking along the joint and appearing on the underside as a dark spot spreading through the dirt. Then she took 2 pieces from her oilcloth bundle and showed the alternative, overlapping them by 4 inches, but staggering them so that the upper piece extended past the lower piece in the direction a roof shingle extends past the one below it, and pressing the far edge of the lower piece slightly into the dirt so that gravity would carry any moisture away from the seam rather than into it. She poured water on this arrangement, and they both watched it run sideways along the shingle edge toward the wall, following the path she had designed for it. "Water is lazy," Mae said. "Give it a downhill road leading away from where people sleep, and it takes that road every time." Ingrid closed her eyes for a count of 3. 3 days of work in the northeast corner. Perhaps 30 square feet, the hardest corner to reach the corner with the worst moisture pressure from outside. All of it laid the wrong way. She opened her eyes and said, "Show me how to do it right." They spent the entire day relaying the northeast corner. Mae worked beside Ingrid rather than above her, her movements precise and economical in the way that 30 or 40 years of doing a thing correctly makes movements. When Ingrid's overlaps were uneven, Mae would lift the sheet without comment and wait. When the pitch mixture cooled and thickened, she showed Ingrid how to warm it again without burning the fat out of it, which happened quickly, and turned the mixture from pliable to brittle in the space of a minute if the heat was too direct. By late afternoon, they had relayed 32 square feet with correct shingle overlaps, and the pitch-fat ash mixture sealing every joint. Mae tested the result by pouring melted snow onto the sand near a seam. The water soaked into the sand reached the bark and turned running sideways along the shingle edge toward the wall rather than through the seam toward the space below. Mae gathered her oilcloth and her tools. At the door, the moccasins back on her feet, she said, "I will come when I can. I am not your hired worker, but I will teach you what the bark knows because you are listening to it. Most people in this territory hear bark and think kindling. You heard it and thought floor." She stepped outside into the November gray. That is a different kind of hearing. The days that followed were measured in square footage, the way other kinds of days are measured in miles covered or loads carried, each unit representing not just progress, but the conversion of time into something that might keep 3 people alive. On the 6th of November, Ingrid harvested 12 sheets from the deadfall upstream, cutting around every knot the way Mae had shown her, warming each sheet near the stove for the minutes it needed to become cooperative. Not one cracked. She laid 80 square feet before the light failed. On the 9th, Mae arrived with a second pot of the pitch mixture and sat with Ingrid while she made a third from scratch. The proportions were not written anywhere. They lived in Mae's hands, and she transferred them through demonstration rather than instruction. A fist-sized lump of pine pitch softened, first in the cracked kettle, then a measure of rendered fat stirred in slowly until it melted through and the mixture lost its brittle transparency. Then a palmful of hardwood ash sifted through a piece of cloth until it was as fine as river silt folded in, until the shine disappeared and the compound took on the appearance of dark mud with grip. Ingrid tried it twice under Mae's observation, getting the ash proportion wrong the first time and the heat wrong the second, and by the third attempt producing something Mae tested by pressing a sealed seam and applying water and watching the water behave the way it was supposed to behave. 104 square feet. On the 12th, Lars began helping. He was not large enough or steady enough to lay bark or handle hot pitch, but he could sift sand through a piece of cut sacking and carry it in the bucket to wherever Ingrid was working. One bucket of correctly sifted sand covered approximately 4 square feet at the right depth. Lars carried 11 buckets that day without being asked to carry a single one, moving between the sand pile outside and the cabin interior with a focused seriousness that was new in him, different from the careful silence of grief. This was purposeful. This was a child finding that his body could be useful to the people he loved, which is a different thing from obedience and matters in a different way. 130 square feet. Ingrid's hands had blistered along both thumbs where the pitch rag rubbed the skin raw, and she worked the blisters through without stopping because stopping was a calculation she could not afford. On the 14th, Sidon kept the sand dry. Wet sand was not a minor problem. Sand that had absorbed moisture held it rather than shedding it, which would have defeated the entire purpose of the barrier beneath it, turning a moisture-blocking surface into a moisture-holding one. Sina lay on the platform between coughing fits and managed the pans near the stove, rotating them to keep the sand consistently dry, which was work that looked passive from the outside and was not passive from the inside of a body fighting to breathe. 152 square feet. On the 16th, a warm rain came through. It ran under the south door and crossed 3 feet of bare dirt before reaching the edge of the bark section, and the bark held at that edge. Water pooled on the exposed dirt rather than penetrating the seams. But the bare half of the floor became mud-soft and dark, and the sand Ingrid had already laid at the boundary of the bark section washed into a brown slurry that took 2 hours to scrape and replace. She lost the day's progress restoring what the rain had undone. 152 square feet still, and the deadline had shortened by 1 more day. On the 18th, she found that one of the bark rolls stored against the east wall had molded. Gray-green growth across the inner surface where the bark had rested against the damp boards. She peeled the mold away, but the bark beneath it had gone soft and punky, the fibers compromised, useless for floor work. She had stored it too close to the wall and too far from the stove's warmth, and Mae had not warned her about storage, because to Mae it was obvious the way the location of water is obvious to someone who has lived beside a river for 60 years. 14 square feet of prepared bark gone. The loss sat in the room with a weight disproportionate to its size because it represented not just bark, but the hours of harvesting and carrying and preparation that had produced it, and those hours were not available to be spent again. Ingrid said a word she had learned from a man on the docks in Minnesota who had dropped a crate of glass on his foot, and then she picked up the knife and her coat and walked back to the river. On the 20th, Voss refused lamp oil. She had asked for a single quart because the evenings were shortening, and she needed light to seal seams after Lars was asleep, when the cabin was quiet enough to work with precision. Voss said her account was at its limit, and he could not justify further credit. She offered to pay in labor, sewing, mending, anything that used her hands, and he said he needed $31, not mending. She left the store and walked back to the cabin in the dark and worked by firelight after that, which was slower because the flickering made it difficult to judge whether the pitch was spreading evenly into the seam or pooling at the edges. 170 square feet. On the 22nd, she opened the door in the early morning and found a sack of dry sand on the step. 20 pounds perhaps, enough to cover 16 square feet. No note. The footprints in the frozen mud were small, a child's boots recently worn. Sigrid Strand was 11 years old and had her mother's practical intelligence and her own quiet kindness, and the sand meant something that no note could have said more clearly. Clara still doubted the method, but she did not want to watch children freeze. A sack of sand cost nothing but the carrying, and some doubts are compatible with small generosities. 186 square feet. On the 25th, Mae came for the 4th time. She brought a curved bone scraper, its working edge worn smooth by decades of use, and she showed Ingrid how to use it along the seams to press the pitch compound into every gap without tearing the bark surface, holding the scraper at a low angle, pressing with the weight of the arm rather than the wrist, drawing it slowly along the joint so the compound moved ahead of the edge rather than bunching before it. They worked in silence for 3 hours side by side on their knees, and at the end of the 3rd hour, Mae said, "Your hands have learned something this month." Ingrid looked at her hands. They were cracked across the knuckles and black in the creases from pitch and stained at the thumb joints where the blisters had reopened and healed and reopened again. My mother said I had sewing hands. Sewing and bark laying are the same labor. You are closing a surface against what presses through. Mae sat back on her heels and looked at the floor. Your father gave you the principle. But principle without the work of making it real is just a good memory. You are making it real. She paused. That is not a small thing. 214 square feet. Raymond Cobb returned on the 28th of November on foot without the mare. His collar turned up against a wind that had shifted north 2 days earlier and showed no intention of shifting back. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the floor, more than 2/3 of the cabin's dirt surface covered in bark and pale sand, a clean border between the finished section and the remaining bare dirt near the south door. The difference between the two surfaces was visible to anyone who looked. The covered section was dry. The bare section was not. He stepped inside and set his hat on the shelf near the door. He stepped onto the bark and shifted his weight. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the sand and then scraped the sand aside with the edge of his belt knife and pressed his palm against the bark beneath. He lifted a corner of one sheet and looked at the dirt under it, and then he stood up and looked at Ingrid with the expression of a man whose established calculations have produced an unexpected result. The dirt under the bark is dry. Yes. He walked to the bare section near the south door and pressed his palm against the dirt. They're wet. He walked back to the bark section and pressed again dry. He did this twice more with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has learned not to trust first measurements. The difference resolved itself the same way each time. It's a canoe turned wrong side up. He said it quietly more to himself than to anyone in the room. Mae sorting bark strips near the stove without looking up. A canoe knows which side the water belongs on. Cobb looked at her for a moment, then looked at Ingrid. That's a good line, but winter is not a good line. A warm November and a cup of water are not January. Ingrid said she knew. You're short on fuel. 2 cords against that wall. You need 4 more at minimum. If the floor stays dry, I'll burn less than 6. That's a theory. He put his knife back in his belt. Theories freeze. He picked up his hat from the shelf and moved toward the door, and then stopped. And the stopping itself was different from the stopping he had done in October when he had turned back to deliver the word stubborn. This stopping was the pause of a man whose certainty has a crack in it. He left without telling her to sell the cow. He left without suggesting rooms in town. The word stubborn did not appear. Those absences meant something that no amount of words would have meant as cleanly. She finished the floor on the 4th of December. 288 square feet of packed dirt covered in overlapping birch bark sheets laid like shingles, every seam sealed with the pitch-fat ash compound that Mae had carried in a clay pot across the frozen ground, the entire surface blanketed in 1 inch of sifted sand that Lars had carried by the bucket and Sina had dried by the panful. The last section, the strip near the south door where the threshold leaked and the ground stayed wettest longest, she laid in double bark, 2 layers with the seams in the upper layer, staggered so that no gap above aligned with any gap below. Extra compound on both layers, coarser sand that would not wash. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked at what she had made. It looked like dirt. Pale, sandy dirt, undistinguished, the kind of surface a visitor would glance at and move past without noticing. There was nothing in its appearance that announced itself, nothing that said this floor is different from every other floor in this territory. Nothing that said 6 weeks and 400 sheets and 3 pots of compound and 2 blistered thumbs in 1 molded roll and 1 borrowed afternoon of sand and 1 woman who knew what bark knows went into the ground beneath your feet. That night, she moved her pallet back to the floor and slept on the bark for the first time. She woke once in the dark and reached from under the blanket and touched the sand beside her. It was cool. It was dry. She went back to sleep, and the fact that she did not dream about the floor was the only evidence she needed that it was finished. Problems inhabit sleep until they are solved, and then they let you go. December was the kind of mild that makes people careless. Temperatures hovered just below freezing during the day and dropped to 10 or 15 below at night, cold enough to maintain winter's presence, without testing anyone's preparations in earnest. Ingrid tested the floor the only way she could, which was to let it work and watch for failure. She kept the stove at a reduced draw for 1 full night and checked the bedding in the morning not damp. She left flour sacks on the floor for 3 days, then a week dry. She placed a tin cup under the sleeping platform, Mae's suggestion, and checked it each morning for the condensation on the outer surface that a cup left on an ordinary dirt floor would collect within hours. The cup stayed dry for 4 days, for 7, for 12. Sina noticed the change in herself before she remarked on it to anyone. The cough is quieter at night. She said it carefully, the way someone mentions an improvement they are not yet willing to trust in case the naming of it causes its reversal. Ingrid did not know whether the dry floor was the cause or whether Sina's lungs were simply recovering from whatever had been attacking them since the train west. What she knew was that the bedding was dry and the air in the cabin no longer carried the particular heaviness of a space that is sharing its moisture with everything inside it. Clara Strand visited in mid-December and stood on the bark floor in her outdoor boots without being asked to remove them, which Ingrid noted but did not address because the floor was sealed well enough to survive a brief visit from a neighbor who had sent her daughter with sand before the method was proven. Clara stood on the sand and looked at the floor and said, "It feels different. It is different. December is not January." No, December was not January. Clara left and Ingrid began to prepare for what January would actually require, checking the pitch lines near the stove where the heat might dry the compound too fast and cause contraction resealing, two spots that had pulled slightly from the bark edges, adding sand to a section near the east wall where foot traffic had worn the surface thin. The floor was not finished in the way a plank floor is finished, complete and static. It required tending the same attentiveness the stove required, and Ingrid understood this not as a burden, but as a condition of the thing she had built. It was alive in the same sense that any barrier against a persistent force is alive. It needed to be maintained because what it was holding back never stopped pressing. On the 11th of January, a warm front pushed up from the south and held temperatures above freezing for 3 consecutive days. Snow softened to slush. Ice cracked in the wheel ruts and filled with brown water. People said the winter was breaking early, which people always said during the January thaw, without ever learning to stop saying it. Ingrid went outside and looked at the ground around the cabin. The yard was saturated the snowmelt from the surrounding grade running in sheets or toward the low northeast corner, exactly as Cobb had identified in October. Water stood in every depression and seeped toward the foundation logs, with the patient determination of water pursuing the lowest available point. She went inside and pressed her palm to the floor dry. But she looked at the sky to the north. The gray there had a yellowish undertone along the horizon, a color her father had pointed out to her once on a winter afternoon in Maine, when she was young enough that his knowledge of the sky seemed like the same thing as the sky's knowledge of itself. He had called it the wolf sky, the sky that wears a mild face while it is building something behind it. She remembered the color, precisely remembered standing beside him in their yard while he pointed north and said nothing else because the color said enough. She checked the seams that evening twice. She placed dry cloth at the threshold. She told Lars to stamp his boots on the step before crossing inside. She went to sleep, watchful. The wind woke her just before noon on the 12th of January. It did not arrive as a gust or even as a gale. It arrived as pressure, a mass of moving air that struck the south wall of the cabin with the weight of something that had been traveling for a long time and had not slowed. The door latch rattled and held. The chimney draft reversed and blew ash into the room. Ingrid went to the window, and what she saw through the frost-edged glass was not a storm arriving, but a storm already present, already totaled the sky to the northwest, the color of iron that has been left to cool on a forge and retains its heat without showing it. Snow was not falling. It was traveling horizontally, driven by wind, with a velocity that made the distinction between air and frozen water meaningless. The visibility through the window had already dropped to less than the distance between the cabin and the woodpile against the west wall. Lars was not in the cabin. He had walked to the Strand place after breakfast to help bring kindling from the outdoor pile before the weather changed, something Ingrid had thought they had enough time for because the sky had been merely gray at breakfast, not yet the iron gray it had become in the 3 hours since. The Strand cabin was 3/4 of a mile east across open ground that was now a white curtain between her and everything on the other side of it. Sina's voice from the platform was steady, in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking knows that the alternative to steady is not useful. You cannot go out into that. Ingrid went to the door and opened it. The wind took it from her hand and drove it into the outer wall hard enough that the latch bracket flexed. Snow poured through the opening. Not the heavy, wet snow of storms that hover near freezing, but the fine, dry, crystalline kind that moves like sand in a gale, filling the threshold in seconds, cutting at the skin of her face and hands. In the moment before she pulled the door shut and leaned her full weight against it, she stood with her back to the door and felt the cold coming through the wood as though the boards were paper. The wind pressure against the south wall was continuous and increasing, not gusting, but building the way a river builds against a dam when the snowmelt arrives. She had to trust Clara Strand. Clara had 4 children and a plank floor and 4 cords of wood in the practical intelligence of a woman who managed everything that came at her with arithmetic and planning. Clara would not let a child walk into what was happening outside. Clara would keep Lars inside and fed and close to the stove, and Ingrid had to place her faith in that and then turn around and address what was in front of her, because the alternative, walking into a whiteout across open ground with no rope and no landmarks, would accomplish nothing except to remove from Lars the parent who had walked out the door to find him. She fed the stove. She counted what was left against the south wall, 14 logs inside the cabin. At the burn rate, the cold required 1 log every 40 minutes. 14 logs gave her between 9 and 10 hours of heat. She reduced the rate to 1 log every 50 minutes and accepted the colder air that resulted, watching her breath begin to appear before her face as a pale cloud. Mae Birch had come that morning to deliver a fresh pot of compound. The storm had caught her on the river path, and she had reached the cabin 20 minutes before the whiteout because she had felt the wind change 200 yards from the cabin door and understood what the change meant in a way that required no sky reading, because it lived in her body after 60 winters of paying attention. She sat near the stove with a blanket around her shoulders, quiet watching. 3 hours into the storm, Daniel Pruitt hit the east wall. The sound was not a knock. It was the sound of a person losing their footing against a solid surface, a body making contact with wood in the way that bodies make contact with things when they have been driven there rather than directed. Ingrid opened the east door, which was sheltered from the worst of the wind by the cabin's orientation, and Pruitt fell through the gap, landing face down on the sand with a force that compressed the surface beneath him. His beard was frozen in a solid mass, and the shoulders of his coat were rigid as boards. He was 23 years old and had been trying to reach the feed barn behind Voss's store when the wind had turned him 90 degrees from his heading and walked him sideways into the fence line at the edge of Ingrid's claim. Mae was already at the threshold. Boots off, coat off, nothing wet crosses this floor. Pruitt lifted his face from the sand, still processing where he was. He looked at Mae, then at Ingrid, then at the floor around him. It's a dirt floor. It is not a dirt floor. Mae's voice had the particular quality of someone who has been making the same correction for a long time and finds nothing personal in the necessity. Your boots are soaked through. Take them off at the threshold or stand back outside. Pruitt looked at Ingrid. Her voice was even the tone of a woman who has stopped having energy to spare for convincing people of things that have already been demonstrated. She is right. Wet boots will foul the sand and break the pitch seal. Take them off where you are and come inside. He peeled the boots off with hands that had mostly stopped functioning and dropped them at the threshold. Ingrid hung them near the stove where they could dry without dripping on the bark. The snow he had tracked in was already melting into the sand at the entry. She scraped the wet layer away and replaced it from the dry reserve she had stored in the large flour barrel for exactly this kind of problem, working quickly because the longer wet sand sat against the bark, the more pressure it would create at the seams from above rather than from below. Pruitt sat on the floor near the east wall, sock feet on the sand, and pressed his hand flat against the surface around him. An hour later, with the boots mostly dry and the coat steaming on its peg, he said, "This floor is dry, not to anyone in particular. To the floor itself or to the fact of it?" Ingrid said yes without elaboration, because yes was the answer and elaboration was not necessary. Clara Strand's floor is dirt, same as everyone else on the low ground. She did not respond. The thought that followed his statement had too much weight to carry in words at that moment, because if Clara's floor was bare dirt and the thaw of the last 3 days had saturated the ground before the freeze hit, then Clara's floor was now in the process of becoming what Ingrid had spent 6 weeks preventing her own floor from becoming, a frozen slab that would pull heat out of the room faster than any stove could return it. And Lars was in that cabin. Lars, who had not spoken for weeks after his father died and had started speaking again only when the work of carrying sand buckets gave him something his hands could do for the people he loved. The storm reached its full force in the early afternoon and did not diminish as the hours passed. The south wall flexed in the wind, and a board in the upper section worked loose and began to flap, opening a 2-inch gap that let cold and snow pour through in a visible stream. Sina stuffed it with cloth, then her spare shawl, then a piece of bark that Ingrid cut from the reserve stack, which held better than the cloth because it was rigid enough to wedge into the opening and resist the suction the wind created on each cycle. Ingrid nailed a second board over it with the last 3 nails in the cabin. Pruitt held the board flat against the wall while she drove the nails because he was larger and could hold it steady against the pressure that kept trying to push it back. The stove ate wood, 9 logs, 8, 7. 2 hours before dawn, someone beat against the door with the flat of a fist. Ingrid opened it into a wall of white, and a shape came through, not walking through, falling through a boy of 12 with frost in his eyebrows and lips the color of slate in November. Henrik Strand, Clara's oldest, who had crossed 3/4 of a mile of whiteout in the dark because his mother had told him that the Holt cabin had a different floor and Ingeborg needed different. Ingeborg was 3 years old and had been shaking since noon. He got the words out in pieces, the way words come out. When the mouth has been fighting cold for a long time, his mother sent him the floor in their cabin was ice. Nothing was working. Ingeborg would not stop, shaking her lips, had gone dark. Ingrid looked at Mae. Mae was already on her feet. "I need rope." Her voice was operational now, the voice of someone who has already moved past the question of whether and arrived at the question of how. Pruitt offered his halter line 25 feet, not enough for 3/4 of a mile. Mae said to tie it to the door frame, walk to the end, drive a stake tie, on more line walk to the next stake, keep going. Ingrid said she had no stakes. Mae said to use the axe handle, the shovel grip, the frame boards from the pallet, anything that would stand upright and pack snow. Ingrid tied Pruitt's halter line to the door frame ring and knotted the other end around her own waist, then put on Erik's coat and pulled her scarf over everything below her eyes. She went out. The wind did not howl. Howling implies a voice, and a voice implies something alive and purposeful. This wind was neither. It was mechanical force, a quantity of moving air that pressed against everything it encountered with the indifference of physics. The snow was not falling or even blowing by any ordinary definition. It had replaced the air suspending itself in the space where air had been so dense that breathing required turning away from the wind and pulling each breath through the weave of the scarf. She could not stand. The wind pushed her sideways at every step. She went to her knees and crawled the last portion to the fence post. At the claim boundary, tied the halter line. To the post, went back inside for more line. There was no more rope in the cabin. She tore the sideboards from the sleeping platform pallet and used the longest one 6 feet as a bridge from the fence post into the dark, crawling along it and driving the axe handle into the snow at its far end, tying her scarf to the axe handle as a marker she could find by feel on the return. The process was brutal, not because of its difficulty, but because of its cost. Each trip out used something that could not be replaced except by going back inside, and in going back inside used time that Ingeborg Strand did not have. Pruitt went with her on the second extension, and his weight and size meant he could push through drifts that stopped Ingrid entirely, and together they reached the fence line between Ingrid's claim and the Strand grazing strip. Halfway. Another hour of cold that made the previous hours of cold seem like a mild disagreement about temperature. They reached Clara's door. The sound coming from inside the cabin before the door opened was a child crying in the thin, sustained way that children cry when they have been crying long enough to lose the force of it, but not the need. Clara opened the door, and the air that came out was warm from the stove, but wet in a way that Ingrid felt against her face like a second cold, a different kind of cold. The cold that lives inside warmth when the moisture content is high enough to carry heat away from anything it touches. The floor was ice, not frozen dirt with frost in it. Ice smooth and faintly reflective in the stove's glow. The product of ground that had absorbed 3 days of snowmelt and then been struck by temperatures that dropped 30 degrees in an afternoon. The stove was burning at a rate that would exhaust what remained of Clara's winter's supply in hours. The heat rose. The cold radiated upward from 600 square feet of frozen ground and met the heat somewhere around waist height, and the two forces traded the room between them, and what lived below that boundary belonged to winter. Clara's children were on the sleeping platform with their legs pulled up, because touching the floor was like pressing bare skin against the metal side of a water trough in February. Lars was there. He was sitting with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest and his remaining mitten on his left hand, and when he saw Ingrid come through the door, his face did the thing that children's faces do when what they have been holding arrives at its limit. She crossed the room in 4 steps and put both arms around him and held him for the count of 5 no longer, because there was no time, and then she put him down and found Ingeborg. The child was wrapped in everything Clara owned in the way of blankets, and was still shaking the continuous mechanical shiver of a body that has exhausted every other option for generating heat. Her lips were the color of a winter sky just before dark. She weighed almost nothing. The skin on her forehead was cold in a way that went past cold into something that had a different quality entirely. Ingrid picked her up. "We're going to my cabin." Clara looked at the floor of her own home. She looked at the ice. She looked at the stove consuming the last of her carefully managed fuel and returning warmth that vanished into the frozen slab beneath their feet. She looked at her daughter in Ingrid's arms and said, "Tell me the rope holds." The rope holds. They went. All of them. Clara carried what she could not leave. Pruitt carried the smallest child. The older children held the rope and turned their faces from the wind and did not stop walking. The crossing took 40 minutes. There were moments when the rope sagged where a stake had shifted, and Ingrid had to leave the line and wade through a drift to reset it each departure from the rope, a brief interval in which she existed in a space with no reference points, and had to return to the line by memory and pressure rather than sight. They came through the door, 8 people in a space built for 3. Clara stepped onto the floor, her sock feet on the sand. She stood there for a moment without moving, registering what the surface felt like under her feet. And her face did something that Ingrid did not look at directly, because some moments require privacy, even when they happen in a crowded room. Dry. Not warm. Nothing was warm. But dry, and the cold that was present in the cabin was the dry cold that a blanket can fight, not the wet cold that makes blankets its collaborators. Ingrid laid Ingeborg on the sleeping platform and wrapped her in the cabin's blankets, which were dry, because they had spent 6 weeks in a space where the air did not carry moisture, the way saturated ground carries it upward through everything it touches. Within an hour, the shaking slowed. Within 2, it stopped. The child was not warm, but her body was no longer losing heat faster than it could produce it, which was the only margin that mattered. 7 logs left, 8 people. The storm pressing against every surface of the cabin with the patience of something that does not experience time the way things inside cabins experience it. Mae sat near the stove with the blanket over her shoulders and said in a voice that was almost conversational, as though she were describing the behavior of bark in a moderate rain. In a 3-day storm, a bark lodge holds people through the night with no stove at all. Only the people holding each other's warmth. A stove is better. It is not the only thing. Ingrid understood what Mae meant without Mae having to say it plainly. If the wood ran out before the storm broke, 7 logs, 8 people, an unknown number of hours, the floor would still be there. 8 bodies under dry blankets on a sealed floor in a closed space retain heat by accumulation, body warming body, the mathematics of proximity. It was not a comfortable calculation. It was, however, a different calculation from the one Clara had been facing in her own cabin, where the frozen slab beneath the floor would have pulled heat out of any arrangement of bodies as efficiently as it had been pulling heat out of the stove. The storm did not break that night. It reached a pitch in the hours before dawn that Ingrid would carry in her body for the rest of her life, not as a memory exactly, but as a physical knowledge. The knowledge of what it felt like to hear a wind that was not a natural event, but a mechanical process, a weight of air pressing against the cabin walls with the sustained force of something that did not tire. She checked the seams near the door by firelight. Holding. She checked the seams near the stove, the area of greatest thermal stress, and found one pitch line that had dried to the edge of pulling away from the bark. She warmed the tip of her knife at the stove's surface and ran fresh compound along the seam with her bare fingers, because the rag was too imprecise for a seam. This narrow, and the compound burned her fingertips at the temperature required to make it flow, and she did not stop until the seam was sealed. 5 logs. She sat on the floor with her back against the north wall and looked at what the floor had become. Not what it looked like dirt, pale and unremarkable, but what it was doing. It was doing what it had been made to do, refusing passage to the thing that had been trying to come through it since October. And the refusal was not dramatic. It was structural. It was permanent in the way that a properly sealed surface is permanent, not forever, but for as long as it is maintained. And maintenance was something she understood now in a way that went past understanding into the body. Outside, the storm continued its indifferent work. Inside, on a floor that looked like dirt and was not 8 people waited for morning, in the particular stillness that arrives when everything possible has been done, and what remains is endurance. The cold pressed its hands against the walls. The walls held. The floor held. The seams held. The storm broke on the morning of the 14th of January. The sky opened to a blue so saturated and absolute that looking at it directly produced a physical ache behind the eyes. The blue of a sky that has spent 3 days compressed under weather and has emerged with something to prove. The temperature sat at 27 below zero, and the snow lay in drifts that reached the eaves of shorter structures and had entirely buried the fence line on the north side of Ingrid's claim. Nothing moved on the roads. The world was white and still and merciless in the particular way that follows a storm when the violence has passed, but its consequences are still being discovered. In Ingrid's cabin, 8 people had survived on 5 logs, dry blankets, and the accumulated warmth of bodies that had no other choice but to share what they produced. Ingeborg Strand had stopped shaking 20 hours into the ordeal and had slept through the final portion of the storm with her face pressed against Sina's collarbone, and her color returning to something that resembled the color of a living child rather than the color Ingrid had found her in at Clara's cabin. She woke on the morning of the 14th and asked for bread in a voice that was thin but insistent, and Clara sat beside her daughter on the sleeping platform and said nothing for a long time, and the silence in that moment had the quality of someone reorganizing everything they believed about what mattered. Ingrid spent the first morning after the storm checking the floor. Every seam along the east wall where the frozen ground outside had pressed against the cabin's foundation with 3 days of sustained force. Every seam near the south door where the double-laid bark had taken the most traffic and the most exposure. The pitch lines near the stove where heat cycles had stressed the compound repeatedly through the storm's duration. She found 2 seams that had shifted slightly at their edges and resealed them with the last of the compound in the clay pot, pressing the material in with her thumb because precision mattered more than comfort. The bark beneath the sand was dry throughout. The dirt beneath the bark was dry throughout. The ground outside the cabin was a solid mass of frozen earth that would not yield to a spade for 3 months, and the ground beneath the cabin's floor had been excluded from whatever the storm had done to everything around it. Clara's cabin, when Lars Strand finally made it back 3 days later, after the roads became passable on horseback, had a floor that had frozen to a depth Cobb later measured at 8 inches. The blankets left behind during the evacuation had absorbed enough ambient moisture to freeze rigid, and when Cobb picked one up, it held its shape like a piece of tin rather than folding. The stove had burned out 6 hours after the family left, and everything below knee-height, in the structure, the lower shelves, the stored provisions near the base of the walls, the coiled rope on the floor hook was encased in the frost that forms when a heated space loses its heat source, and the moisture in the air finds every surface it can claim. Cobb came to Ingrid on the 4th day after the storm alone without the clipboard that had accompanied every previous visit. He had gone to the Strand cabin first that morning and spent 15 minutes with a hatchet trying to chip through the ice on the floor before giving up, and then he had ridden to Ingrid's claim. He stood on the bark floor and used his belt knife to scrape the sand aside from a section near the east wall and pressed his thumb against the bark beneath and lifted the edge and looked at the dirt underneath it. He replaced the bark. He swept the sand back into place with his palm. He stood up and looked at Ingrid with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he did not expect to arrive at and is in the process of deciding whether to announce it or simply act on it. Clara Strand burned nearly all her winter fuel trying to heat a frozen slab. She'll need to borrow 2 cords to finish the season. He paused. 2 cords is $20. Nobody on this claim line has $20 in January. He looked at the floor under his feet. You burned less than half a cord during the storm. Ingrid said that was correct. I told you 6 cords and raise planks. I told you to sell the cow and take rooms in town. He was not apologizing. Cobb was not a man who apologized in the same way that a surveyor does not apologize for a measurement that contradicts an earlier estimate. He reported, I was right about the problem. The floor was killing the stove's efficiency and the moisture was going to freeze the ground solid. I was right about all of that. He paused. I was wrong about the solution. You found the part I missed. Ingrid's response came without calculation, without the pause of someone deciding how much credit to accept. The part was not mine. My father showed me the principle in Maine. Mae Birch showed me the technique here. And the bark itself taught both of them in ways that neither of them invented. I am the student in this, not the source. Cobb looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved toward the door and said as he crossed the threshold, something that functioned as the closest thing to a formal acknowledgement his character permitted. I'll be sending people to you. Women mostly. They'll want to know how. They came within the week, arriving one at a time along the frozen roads, with their scarves pulled to their eyes and their questions held carefully the way people carry things they have needed for a long time and are not yet certain they will be allowed to keep. Ruth Edberg came from 2 miles south with flour sack marks on her floorboards, where the moisture had wicked up through the planks and ruined the bottom third of her winter grain supply. Her cabin had a plank floor which she had believed was sufficient, and the storm had demonstrated the specific way in which a plank floor laid directly on dirt is not a moisture barrier, but a moisture conduit with a thin wooden face. She asked whether bark could be laid beneath existing planks without tearing the whole floor up, and Ingrid explained the sequence clear. The planks prepare, the dirt surface, lay the bark in shingle overlaps, seal the seams, replace the planks with a half-inch gap above the bark surface for air movement. And Ruth wrote it on the inside of her coat sleeve with a charcoal stub because she had not thought to bring paper. Barbara O'Neill came from the north side of the valley with 4 children and a husband who had not believed that a dirt floor could affect the efficiency of a cast iron stove until the January storm had reduced his fuel supply by 2/3 in 36 hours, while the stove ran continuously and the room still lost heat through the ground at a rate that kept the lower 2 feet of air at a temperature that frosted boot leather. Barbara had come without her husband, which told Ingrid something specific about the interior geography of that household. She asked precise questions in the manner of someone who has learned to gather complete information before beginning any project, because incomplete information is how projects fail, and projects that fail in winter on a homestead claim fail permanently. Minimum overlap on seams. Whether bark could be patched if a section tore rather than replacing the entire sheet. Whether stove sparks would penetrate an inch of sand before reaching the bark surface. Whether rodents would burrow beneath the installed barrier looking for nesting material. Ingrid answered from experience rather than theory, which was the only kind of answer that had value in a conversation between 2 women who understood the difference. 4 inches minimum more near doors and along walls where moisture pressure was highest. Patches could be laid over tiers and sealed with fresh compound, the repair process identical to the original installation. She had tested spark penetration by dropping a live coal from the stove onto an inch of sand and watching it expire before reaching the surface below. Rodents she had seen no evidence of burrowing in 2 months of installation, and Mae had suggested laying a border of wood ash along the wall joints because rodents avoided the alkaline quality of ash, which Ingrid had done and which appeared to be effective. Clara Strand came on a day when the temperature had climbed to 5 below, which qualified as a mild afternoon in the 3rd week of January. She carried a sack of sand and set it at the door without ceremony, and came inside and stood on the bark surface with the boots she had not been asked to remove because the floor was established enough now to manage the ordinary traffic of a neighbor who had walked through frozen mud to reach it. I need to learn the floor. Her voice was even stripped of the particular quality that doubt produces in voices, the careful modulation of someone managing their own skepticism. The doubt was gone because the evidence had removed it, and what remained in its place was not enthusiasm, but something more durable. The practical determination of a woman who has identified a gap in her preparations and intends to close it. Ingrid said she knew. I told you bark was for canoes and kindling. I told you that you were spending days you could not afford on something unproven. You were not wrong about the risk. Every day I spent on bark was a day I did not spend hauling wood. That arithmetic was real. Ingrid paused not for effect, but because what she said next mattered, and she wanted to say it accurately. You were wrong about the idea, but you sent Sigrid with sand before you believed. Before the proof arrived, you still sent sand because you did not want the children to freeze, even if the method was foolish. That is not the same as being wrong. Clara looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Show me the seams." They spent the afternoon on their knees on the cabin floor. Ingrid demonstrating the shingle overlap and the pitch application and the sand coverage, while Clara asked the kind of questions that reveal a mind already running ahead, to implementation questions about square footage, calculations for her specific cabin dimensions, about the correct ratio of fat to pitch in the compound when deer fat was not available, and salt pork fat had to substitute about the timing of seam inspections through the remaining winter months. When Clara left, she carried a bundle of bark sheets under her arm and a small pot of compound in her coat pocket, and the sequence written in Ingrid's careful hand on the back of a flour sack. She did not say that the floor had saved Ingeborg's life. She had told Sina that, and Sina had told Ingrid, and the telling through a third person was its own kind of statement about what gratitude looks like when it is too large to be addressed directly. Kittle Vanson was buried on the 16th of January when the ground had softened enough on the south-facing slope above the river to accept a grave. He was 63 years old and had lived alone in a claim shanty half a mile north of Cobb's fence line, and had gone out to check on his mule during the storm and had not found the shanty again. They found him 40 feet from his own door, frozen in the posture of someone walking with purpose in the wrong direction, which was the posture the cold produced in people who had used all available heat and were continuing by momentum alone. His floor had been bare dirt. His window had no glass. He had lived in the territory for 4 years and had never been convinced that the cold below knee height was as dangerous as the cold above it, and he had been wrong about that in the specific way that the territory collected on. The valley began to account for what the storm had taken and what it had spared, and the accounting had a pattern that people noticed because people in isolated places are skilled readers of patterns. The cabins that had lost the most fuel were the cabins on low ground with bare dirt floors, because bare dirt in the January thaw becomes a heat sink that no stove can outpace. The cabins that had managed on less were the cabins with plank floors, which at least interrupted the direct conduction pathway between frozen earth and living space. And the one cabin on low ground that had used less fuel than any plank-floored structure in the valley was the Holt cabin, which had a dirt floor that was not a dirt floor, and which most of the valley's residents had heard described as an eccentric widow's attempt to paper the ground like a parlor wall. The phrase had traveled the way Ingrid had known it would travel when Voss first said it in November. It had been repeated at the store counter and at the well and at the places where men gathered to discuss each other's decisions, and it had been repeated as a mild amusement, the image of a woman decorating her floor as though the ground required the same attention as a respectable interior wall. The amusement had lasted through November and December and had run directly into the January storm, where it encountered the question of which floors had held their heat and which had not, and had not recovered from that encounter. Daniel Pruitt was in the store on the afternoon that Voss explained to 2 men warming themselves at the counter that the Holt cabin had survived the storm because of superior wall construction, not because of any novelty in the floor, and that the bark was a temporary measure that would soften and fail as the spring moisture arrived, and that Clara Strand's floor had frozen because her husband Lars had not kept the chinking on the north exposure properly maintained. Pruitt stood near the door with a coil of leather he had come to pick up for harness repair and waited until Voss finished, and the 2 men had nodded in the way that men nod when they are told something that requires no effort from them to believe. Then Pruitt said, not loudly in the voice of someone reporting what he personally witnessed rather than what he has concluded, "I slept on that floor during the storm. My boots were soaked through when I came in. The woman and Mae Birch made me take them off at the threshold because they said the floor was not a dirt floor and wet boots would break the seal. I slept on dry ground all night while the storm buried the cabin. When I woke up, the sand was dry and the bark was dry, and my back was not frozen to the ground, which is what would have happened on any other floor on the low ground that night." He picked up the coil of leather. "She built that floor from birch bark and pine pitch and months of work that nobody helped with. It held better than Mr. Voss's plank floor would have held if his store sat where her cabin sits, because her cabin sits lower than his store, and the water table is higher, and the frost goes deeper, and the bark addressed all 3 of those things in sequence." He walked to the door. "That is what I know from being there." Voss said, "That's enough, Daniel." Pruitt left, but the account he had given remained in the room the way accounts given by people who were present remain in rooms with a density that second-hand versions cannot achieve. and the two men at the counter left shortly after without the easy agreement they had arrived with. Owen Marsh arrived in the valley in March of 1888, in the weeks after the storm's consequences had been fully counted and before the spring thaw had made the roads soft again. He had come from Illinois by way of a letter that Cobb had written to a cousin, asking whether any carpenter of sound ability and genuine need of a new location might consider the territory. Owen's wife had died of typhoid the previous spring, and he had a daughter of 9 named Nora and a tool chest he carried with one arm, which said something about his physical capacity and something about how he thought about the things that mattered to him. He arrived after the women had already come to learn the method, and after the valley had begun its accounting of which floors had held and which had not, which meant his first weeks were spent absorbing a story that everyone around him had lived inside. His first contracted work was building raised joist frames for 3 cabins that wanted bark floors beneath proper plank flooring, a design that Ingrid had developed through the winter, combining the bark moisture barrier with a raised frame that created an air gap between the sealed dirt and the living surface. The combination addressed both the moisture problem and the cold floor problem, the bark stopping what the ground pushed up and the air gap preventing direct conduction from the sealed earth to the boards above. He came to the first cabin while Ingrid was still laying bark on the prepared surface, and he looked at the work and crouched and pressed his thumb into a seam in the way that everyone who encountered the floor for the first time seemed compelled to do, as though the only way to believe in the thing was to test it with direct physical contact. Who designed this? He asked it without preamble, looking at the seam work and then at Ingrid. I laid it. Mae Birch taught me the technique. My father gave me the principle. She kept her hands moving on the bark. The seam work is the only part that matters. Everything else is preparation for the seams. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information rather than agreeing. The joist frame needs to sit on the log rounds, not on the bark surface. Direct contact would crush the seams. Yes, and I need a full inch of clearance above the bark. The sealed surface requires air movement above it, or residual moisture accumulates between the bark and the plank. An inch is going to cost headroom. Half an inch will cost the floor. She looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation, and the look was not unfriendly, but it was not negotiable either. I have spent 6 months learning what this floor requires. The inch is not a preference. He looked at the seam under his thumb for a moment, and then at Ingrid, and something shifted in his expression. Not capitulation exactly, but recognition. The recognition that the person across from him knew the specific thing she was talking about in the specific way that people know things they have paid for with their own time and materials and failures. An inch then. They argued about the joist height again 2 days later, and about the planking thickness the day after that, and about whether hardwood ash should be incorporated into the sand layer, as well as the compound. And these arguments were not the arguments of 2 people with opposing interests, but the arguments of 2 people with different competencies trying to build the same thing, and they resolved each one through the only method available to people who are both right about different aspects of the same problem, which is compromise that satisfies neither party completely and produces a result that is better than either would have achieved alone. Nora Marsh, 9 years old, spent the working days near Lars in the way that children of working parents spend time near each other through proximity, that becomes familiarity, that becomes in time the particular ease of people who have known each other before they were old enough to perform themselves. Mae Birch came back to the valley one final time before winter fully released the ground in late March, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth in the clay pot and the curved bone scraper. She had been coughing since February in a way that had changed from the previous month's cough, deeper, wetter, located in a part of her chest that did not respond to warmth or to the medicine she prepared from what she carried. She said nothing about it for 3 weeks after Ingrid noticed it, and then she said, "This cough has been with me 2 winters. It will be with me until it finishes what it started." Ingrid said there was a doctor at the rail town. The doctor at the rail town will confirm what I already know, and what I already know does not benefit from confirmation. She was not being oblique. She was being precise about what a doctor could and could not change about her situation, which was the precision of a woman who has lived 60 years by understanding exactly what each available resource can and cannot accomplish. She inspected every seam on the floor on her hands and knees, pressing her thumb along the pitch lines the way she always had, and found one section near the stove that had dried to the edge of separation, which she resealed with fresh compound and told Ingrid to monitor weekly through the freeze-thaw cycles of early spring. "The floor is not a finished thing," she said. "It is a maintained thing. There is a difference, and the difference is the same as the difference between a fire and a stove. One burns without asking anything of you, and one requires your attention to keep doing what it does." She left 3 things: the clay pot, the bundle of prepared bark sheets, the curved bone scraper with its 30-year edge, which had a slight leftward deviation that Mae had used for decades to follow bark seams, the way water follows the path of least resistance, pressing into the joint rather than across it. At the door, moccasins on bundle under her arm, she turned back. "Do not teach the bark without teaching the tree." It was the same instruction she had given in a slightly different form in November, and the repetition indicated that she considered the risk of violation high enough to warrant restating. "The settlers will want the technique. They will want only that. Technique without the knowledge of where it comes from and what it costs the material source is extraction, not practice. You understand the difference." Ingrid said she did. "You understand it in your mind." Mae looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has taught for a long time and has learned that understanding in the mind and understanding in the practice are separated by a distance that only repetition closes. By the time you have taught this to 20 families, you will understand it in your hands. She walked down the grade toward the river path and did not look back, and Ingrid stood in the doorway and watched until the figure disappeared around the bend, where the willows grew thick on the north bank, and stood there longer than necessary because some departures deserve more than the moment of their happening. She never learned what became of Mae Birch after that March morning. Letters sent north through intermediaries were neither returned nor answered. She chose to believe, because the alternative was darker and served no useful purpose, that Mae had reached her people and spent her remaining time among those who knew what bark could do without needing to be taught because they had always known. The schoolhouse was the moment the method became a community institution rather than a widow's experiment. The school sat on low ground, half a mile from Voss's store, 31 children, a plank floor laid directly on unmodified dirt, and a teacher named Agnes Weil, who had spent 2 winters keeping a bucket of warm water near the stove so children could thaw their boot soles at the midday break. The act of pouring warm water on a floor that was already too wet had been making the problem worse each time, which was the kind of irony that the territory produced regularly. Cobb came to Ingrid in November of 1888 and stood in her doorway with his hat in his hand, which she had not seen before, and asked her to fix the schoolhouse floor. She organized the work party for a Saturday night when the building would be empty until Monday morning. 6 people volunteered without being asked twice: Clara and Lars, Strand, Ruth Edberg, and her brother Cobb himself in Pruitt, who arrived at dusk without having been invited and without explaining his presence, which was an explanation enough. Voss had declined to donate pitch compound from his store's inventory, and Cobb had purchased what was needed on credit and told Voss to record his name accurately in the ledger, which was a form of public statement that only the people present fully understood. They lifted the plank floor on the children's side of the schoolhouse. The dirt beneath was frozen in a crust that broke under the spade into dark, irregular chunks, wet underneath the surface freeze. They cleared it, let it stand near the stove for 2 hours, while Mae's technique, now Ingrid's, to teach, passed from her hands to Clara's hands, and from Clara's hands to Ruth's, each person sealing seams, and the person beside them watching, and then trying and being corrected until the correction became unnecessary. They replaced the planks at 2 in the morning and swept sand level, and built the stove up to full draw and left the doors open until first light. Monday morning, 31 children filed in and sat on the benches above the floor that had been different for 48 hours. Agnes Weil noticed before the children settled, "The floor is different, not warmer." The schoolhouse was still a thin-walled structure with a stove that worked too hard for the space it was asked to heat. But the planks were dry, the boots did not adhere to the wood at midday. The bucket of warm water remained unused beside the stove for the first time in 2 winters. 2 children who had stopped attending because their mothers would not send them to sit for 6 hours on a floor that froze their feet returned to school that week. Ingrid stood in the schoolhouse after the children had gone home on the first day and looked at the floor and thought about what Mae had said in the doorway of her cabin. Do not teach the bark without teaching the tree. She had taught 6 people the technique that day, and she did not know how many of them would remember where it came from. And she did not know how many of the people those 6 people would teach would understand that the knowledge was not hers to have invented, that it had arrived to her through a chain of transmission that predated the territory and everyone who was filing claims in it. She took those 6 people to the birch stand along the Cheyenne the following week and showed them what Mae had shown her, which trees could be harvested without fatal damage, where on the trunk to begin the cut, how to read the signs of a tree that was already under stress from insects or disease and should not be cut at all. She showed them the healing scars on trees that had been harvested correctly in previous seasons, the new bark growing over the wound in layers, the tree's own response to what had been taken from it. She showed them the dead trunks of trees that had been stripped entirely and had not survived the stripping, their wood gray and soft in the damp ground, their absence a specific kind of evidence. This floor is not a product, she told them. It is an agreement between your cabin and the tree that provided the material. If you take from the tree without understanding what you are taking and what it costs the tree, you will exhaust the supply in 5 years and the method will die with the forest. She looked at the stand, 30 trees when she had found it in the autumn of 1887, still 27 living after years of careful harvest. Take what the tree can give. Leave what the tree needs to heal. That is the whole of it. Voss came to Ingrid in the second week of January of 1889, exactly 1 year after the storm. He drove the buckboard with his name on the side, and he came alone, and he stood at the door of the cabin without coming inside. His storage room had developed a moisture problem in the previous week's thaw. A channel beneath the foundation carved by a rotted root had provided a path for snowmelt to seep upward through the dirt and into the plank floor. And 17 sacks of flour had absorbed enough moisture through their base cloth to make the bottom third of each sack unsellable. The loss was $9.35 at cost, which was a specific and visible number of the kind that produced in Voss the same attentiveness that large debts produced in his customers. 3 days later, a second thaw event had reached his salt supply, and the salt had clumped from moisture absorption, and 3 women had returned their purchases to the counter the same morning. He said he needed the storage room floor-lined. Ingrid walked to the store with him and inspected the room. The damage was visible in the dark staining at the base of the south wall, and the warped sections of plank where the wood had swelled and then partially dried and then swelled again. She lifted a board and pressed her hand to the dirt beneath it, and the dirt was the consistency of ground that had been saturated and was in the process of freezing again, the worst possible condition for a storage room that needed to keep its contents dry through a Dakota winter. She put the board back and stood up and faced him. I can line this floor. 1 day of work. I'll need bark compound materials and someone to help lift the planks. How much? I don't take money, but I have a condition. She watched his face while she said it, the face of a man accustomed to setting the terms of exchanges and countering a rearrangement of that expectation. Clear Clara Strand's account. She owes you $11 from last winter's flour and lamp oil. Clear it. He said $11 was $11. Your flour loss is already more than that. Your salt loss adds to it. Before the next hard freeze, if this room stays unlined, you'll lose everything stored against the south wall. $11 against that is the cheapest transaction you'll make this season. He considered it. She could see him considering it, the same arithmetic process she had watched in his eyes in November when he had assessed whether the low acres were worth the trouble of acquiring them. The difference was that the arithmetic now ran in a direction that did not favor delay. Clear Strand's account, and I want you to sell flour and lamp oil at posted price without adding winter interest to any family that asked me about the floor. If they come to you after learning the method, you sell them what they need at the rate written on the board. That is not your business to dictate. Every floor I line reduces what those families owe you in spring. You know that as well as I do. A valley full of people who made it through winter on less fuel and less spoiled grain is a valley full of people who can pay their accounts in April instead of signing over their low acres in March. She held his gaze steadily, not as a challenge, but as an offer of the truth as she understood it. We can pretend otherwise, or we can agree that solvent neighbors are more profitable than failed claims even from your position. He was quiet long enough that the quiet became its own kind of answer. Then, clear Strand's account, posted prices for families you've taught, and you teach Alma how to maintain the seams when they need attention. I'll teach Alma. I'll teach anyone who asks. He looked at the floor of his storage room, the damaged planks in the dark staining, in the evidence of what moisture could accomplish when given an unobstructed pathway. He said, "Show me the seams." And those 3 words in that order carried the weight of everything he had said about parlor walls and eccentric widows and bark that would soften by spring, and they carried it silently the way a floor carries the weight of what passes over it, without making any particular announcement about the burden. Ingrid lined the storage room in a single day with help from Pruitt and Lars Strand, who had learned enough in the months of watching and carrying sand buckets that he could lay bark sections independently and needed correction only on the compound application, which was a matter of pressure and angle rather than concept. She paid particular attention to the south wall where the moisture channel ran, laying double bark at that boundary, with staggered seams, the same technique she had used at her own south door. Alma Voss watched the entire process with the attentiveness of someone who intends to perform a procedure themselves rather than delegate it. She asked questions that were more specific than her husband's: the interval at which seams should be inspected during periods of freeze-thaw cycling, what to do if a plank was replaced and the disturbance damaged the bark beneath it, whether the compound could be mixed in winter when rendered fat was harder to source. Ingrid answered each question fully and wrote a maintenance schedule on a piece of cardstock that Alma pinned to the storage room wall where it would be visible each time the room was entered. Voss cleared Clara's account that afternoon. The following week, he posted flour and lamp oil at the board prices without the winter margin he had been adding for 3 years. He did not explain the change to anyone who asked. He did not need to. The valley understood that something had shifted in the arithmetic of who held leverage over whom, and the understanding moved through the community the way understanding moves in isolated places, quietly through observation, without anyone needing to make a speech. Some people understood the whole of what Mae had intended when she said, "Do not teach the bark without teaching the tree." Some understood it partially. Some understood it only as a practical matter of supply management, which was not the same understanding, but produced compatible behavior. The birch stand along the Cheyenne Bend held 27 living trees through the spring of 1893. 3 had been lost to storm damage, none to harvesting. That was the number that mattered. Owen and Ingrid married in the spring of 1892 in the schoolhouse on the floor they had both helped to build. The ceremony was attended by Cobb and by Clara, with all 4 children, including Ingeborg, who was 7 years old and entirely unaware that she had nearly died on a frozen floor 4 winters earlier, and who contributed to the proceedings primarily by asking whether the bread served afterward could be cut into a larger piece. Alma Voss sent cotton fabric, which Ingrid made into a dress for Nora, because Alma had watched the floor being laid in her husband's storage room and had asked questions sharper than her husband's, and had maintained the seams herself every autumn since without being reminded. Lars grew into a young man who combined his mother's understanding of moisture barriers with Owen's structural knowledge, developing over several years a system that used bark and tar paper together. The bark as the primary moisture barrier across the floor surface, and the tar paper at the wall, junctures where bark alone was vulnerable to the compression forces of settling timber. Sina recovered fully from the cough by the summer of 1889 and became the teacher at the schoolhouse, which she maintained through 3 more winters with the same attentiveness she had brought to keeping sand dry in the pans near the stove during those weeks in 1887, checking the seams every October and relaying sand every November with the help of her oldest students. The curved bone scraper hung on a nail above the stove in every house Ingrid lived in, from 1888 until her death, wrapped in a piece of cloth to protect the edge that Mae had spent 30 years refining. When younger settlers asked about it, Ingrid told them it had belonged to the woman who had taught her which side the water belonged on. Some of them understood what that meant in its full complexity: the water, the bark, the tree, the knowledge, the chain of transmission, the obligation that knowledge carries when it passes from one person to another across a boundary of culture and circumstance. Some of them understood it more partially. Some of them saw an old tool and nodded politely. Ingrid had stopped minding the polite nods by the time she was 40. What she minded and continued to mind until the end was forgetting the specific forgetting that allowed a method to travel through a community stripped of its origin, arriving at its 20th iteration, without the name of the person who had carried it across the November ground to a lean-to beside a rock face, and taught it in silence with her hands rather than her words. The scraper on the wall was her argument against that forgetting a physical object that required explanation whenever it was noticed, and the explanation required the name, and the name required the chain, and the chain led back to Mae Birch, and from Mae Birch to the Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes country, and from them to the bark itself, which had been doing what bark does long before anyone thought to put it on a floor. The valley continued its life around the floor that Ingrid had built, and the method she had taught, and the method became part of the valley's practical inheritance in the way that useful knowledge becomes part of the places it saves. By 1891, she was called to inspect damp cabins before each winter and to organize bark harvesting parties that followed the harvesting rules Mae had established. And the calls came from people who no longer thought of it as unusual to send for her, which was its own kind of measure. They called it Holt lining. She asked them not to. The name outlasted the asking. Names do. Ingrid Holt died in the winter of 1917 at the age of 59 in the house Owen had built on the higher ground above the river bend in her sleep, on a floor that Lars had lined with bark and tar paper the previous autumn. The temperature outside was 11 below zero. The stove had burned down to coals during the night. The room had held its warmth because the ground beneath the house was sealed away, and the cold that pressed upward from the frozen earth could not reach the woman who had spent 30 years teaching her valley how to stop it. The first cabin, the 16 by 18-foot structure, with 2 log walls and 2 board walls in a dirt floor that had been wet when she pressed her palm against it in October of 1887, became a storage building and then a workshop and then a ruin when the sod roof finally gave way in 1903. But the bark floor outlasted the walls that had sheltered it. When Lars cleared the site in 1907, he found the bark sheets still intact beneath 20 years of accumulated debris. The pitch lines darkened and hardened, but uncracked the seams, holding the same relationship to each other that Ingrid and Mae had established in the weeks before the ground froze. He pressed his palm against a section of it and held it there for a moment, in the way his mother had pressed her palm against the floor throughout the winter of 1887, measuring, assessing, learning what the ground was doing beneath whatever surface he placed his hand on. He covered it back over. The bark did not need to be seen to do what it was doing. In the schoolhouse on a mild afternoon in early March of a later year, a child dropped a mitten from the bench and it fell to the sanded floor and lay there, and the child reached down and picked it up, and it was dry. And the child did not think about the bark beneath the planks that had made it dry, because children do not think about what keeps them comfortable any more than they think about what keeps them warm, which is the precise measure of how well a thing works. The best solutions disappear into the ordinary. They become the condition of life rather than the answer to a problem. And after a generation, no one remembers the problem clearly enough to understand what was solved. Outside, the March thaw was making rivers of the wheel ruts and turning the schoolyard to mud. Inside, children copied sums on slates with their feet planted on pale sand above bark, above sealed earth, above the particular darkness from which all the cold and all the moisture that had once moved freely upward into the lives of the people above, it had been excluded one seam at a time by hands that had learned which side the water belonged on and had spent the rest of their lives teaching other hands the same. The floor looked like dirt. Underneath it remembered the river.